Before dawn, the trench is not a line in a war. It is mud climbing over your boots, cold water finding the torn seam in your sock, and the sour smell of wet wool, old smoke, and men who have stopped sleeping properly. A letter from home sits inside your tunic, its corners soft from damp, unread for the third time because the guns have been working all night, and every sound now feels like the one that comes before shouting. You wait on the fire step with your rifle against the parapet and your hands too numb to trust. Somewhere beyond the wire, in the dark no map can make less dark, another line of men is waiting too. History will call this an operation, an offensive, a date pinned to a page. But inside the trench, it is hunger, standing water, bad air, and the slow discovery that war is less about charging forward than learning how long a human being can remain afraid without leaving his place there. This is the life you are about to walk through, not as one man in one moment, but through every layer of rank a British trench soldier could rise into on the Western Front. You begin at the bottom, where the war works first, on the body. Cold, weight, rot, hunger. The discipline of standing where you are told, while fear keeps moving through you like weather. Then the cost changes. It stops being only about whether you can endure the trench and becomes whether other men can endure it under you. That is what rank means here. Not prestige, not safety, not distance from the mud. Only a wider circle of consequence. At first, you are trying to survive the night. Later, you are trying to keep a few others alive through it. Later still, you are responsible for names, not numbers, and for decisions that stay with you longer than the war itself. And the first version of that burden begins where all of them do, low in the trench, with a private who still thinks surviving is the whole job. You enter the war at the point where it is least romantic and most physical. As a private, you do not command anything except your own ability to keep moving when your clothes are wet, your stomach is empty, and the trench keeps asking your body to accept one more miserable thing. The rifle, the bayonet, the entrenching tool, the ammunition, the gas mask, the rations, the ground sheet. It all hangs from you with the blunt logic of the army. Nobody cares whether it feels heavy. It is heavy. You carry it. Your day begins before the light. Stand to at dawn, rifle ready, eyes on the strip of torn earth ahead, because morning is when attacks are most feared. Then the routine that keeps men alive if the shells do not interrupt it first. Clear the mud, check the parapet, reinforce the sandbags, empty the water where water can be emptied, eat what arrives cold, and pretend the smell has not settled into everything you own. By afternoon, your feet are swollen from damp. By night, you are working again, because darkness is for wiring parties, patrols, carrying parties, and the kind of waiting that makes every minute feel unfinished. The first thing the trench teaches you is simple. Courage is not a charge. It is staying in place when nothing around you feels fit for a human life. And once you learn that, the war finds a way to ask for more than your own survival. The first stripe does not lift you out of the trench. It sinks you deeper into it. As a lance corporal, and then a corporal, the mud is still yours, the cold is still yours, the rats, the lice, the bad tea, the sleepless dawns are still yours. But now a few other men start looking at your face before they trust their own fear. That is the change. Not ceremony, not pride, just the quiet knowledge that if you panic first, someone else may follow. You learn this the ordinary way, which is to say, the hard way. A wiring party after dark. 4 men. A reel of barbed wire. Cut hands inside wet gloves. No moon. Which helps until a flare goes up and turns the whole world white for 3 terrible seconds. Everyone drops. Nobody speaks. You can hear breathing, metal, and somewhere farther out, the sound of someone else moving low through the dark. When the light dies, the work continues, because broken wire by morning means dead man by dawn. A sergeant does not give you a speech about leadership. He watches whether you keep your hands steady enough for the others to keep working. That is the lesson. Not how to look brave, how to remain useful while afraid. By the time you come back over the parapet, soaked and half frozen, you understand something rank had not yet taught you. The war is not only fought in attacks. Much of it is held together by men fixing, carrying, checking, and going back out again. And the next rank will ask whether you can do more than steady 4 men in the dark. By the time you become a sergeant, the war has stopped feeling like a sequence of frightening moments and started feeling like a machine that only works because someone keeps noticing what will fail next. On paper, the platoon belongs to the officer. In the trench, much of it belongs to you. You know which men can function on 2 hours of sleep and which ones begin to come apart quietly. You know who jokes when he's afraid, who goes silent when the shelling gets close, who still writes home every Sunday, and who has stopped. That last detail matters more than it sounds. In this war, men often break by degrees before they break all at once. Orders come down for a trench raid in 2 nights. A few men over the top after dark, into the enemy line, in and out before the artillery or machine guns can settle on the route. The officer studies the map. You study everything the map leaves out. The wire that may not be cut cleanly. The mud that will slow the return. The runner who may not get back. The way one wounded man can turn 12 minutes into 20 and 20 into disaster. So, you prepare the platoon the way experienced men always do. You check equipment. You repeat timings. You watch faces. You remove one young private from the list without humiliating him for being relieved. No speech. No drama. Just one small correction that might keep him alive long enough to become useful later. That is what rank has become now. Not being harder than other men. Being responsible for the parts of them that are starting to fray. And from here, the burden only gets quieter and heavier. The hardest part was never getting into the trench. It was discovering that the war kept taking things from you after you had already learned how to endure it. First, comfort. Then certainty. Then the easy version of yourself that believed surviving was enough. And the higher you go, the less this life becomes about what you can withstand alone. So stay with it, because from here, the mud matters less than the decisions made above it, and the cost becomes harder to see, but much harder to carry. As company sergeant major, you are no longer judged by moments of obvious courage. You are judged by whether the company is still functioning by the time dawn comes. This is the part outsiders rarely imagine. They picture whistles, charges, medals, and maps with arrows on them. They do not picture you in half-light before the officers are fully awake, already moving through a trench line that never stops decaying. A parapet sagging where the rain has eaten into it. A ration party that left ammunition in the wrong traverse. A runner too exhausted to think clearly. A man who says he is fine because saying otherwise feels too close to shame. You notice all of it, because if you do not, the trench collects small failures until one of them becomes a death. Most of your best work leaves no story behind. A section gets reinforced before the wall gives way. A man is pulled off the line for a night before sleeplessness turns into collapse. A young officer is quietly redirected before he mistakes confidence for judgment. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the success. You begin to understand the real shape of the war here. It is not only a war of attacks. It is a war of maintenance. timing, drainage, carrying, checking, repeating, and absorbing the distance between what headquarters assumes and what the trench can actually bear. You are still in the mud. You are simply carrying more of its consequences than before. And the next step upward will not bring relief. It will bring authority without the comfort of experience. The commission gives you distance in theory, not in feeling. As a second lieutenant, you now carry a whistle, a map case, and a kind of authority that feels far heavier than it looked from below. You are young enough that some of the men in your platoon have seen more of this war than you have. That is the first humiliation, and if you are sensible, the first education. The sergeant does not embarrass you by saying it aloud. He simply waits to see whether you are the kind of officer who needs to be right, or the kind who wants the men to come back. You learn the answer during preparation for a night raid. A fresh private, barely steady in the trench, keeps masking his fear with talk. Too fast, too loud, too eager. You recognize the danger because you remember it in yourself from years lower down when fear still came dressed as energy. The easy thing would be to mistake that noise for spirit. The harder thing is to pull him aside, lower your voice, and take him off the raiding party before pride gets him killed. He thinks you are punishing him. You let him think it. That is the change rank has made in you. You no longer confuse bravery with forward motion. You begin to understand that command is not the right to send men toward danger. It is the burden of deciding who should go, who should wait, and what kind of mistake will follow them longest if you choose badly. And if you survive long enough to rise again, the war will widen until judgment alone is no longer enough. By the time you are a lieutenant, and later a captain, the war stops arriving as a single threat and starts arriving as a system of demands that never presents itself all at once. A platoon, then a company, begins to live inside your head even when you are off the line. Duty rosters, ammunition returns, fatigue parties, casualty lists, rations delayed in mud-choked communication trenches. A message from battalion that assumes strength you no longer have. A map reference copied wrongly by a tired clerk that could send men toward the wrong stretch of wire. None of it looks heroic. All of it can kill. This is the burden people outside the war rarely see. They imagine command as the privilege of giving orders. In truth, much of command is absorbing friction. You spend hours making sure the wounded can be moved if the line is hit, that the Lewis gun team has what it needs, that the officers under you are tired but still clear-headed, that the sergeants are not solving every problem alone simply because they are more reliable than the men above them. A company does not hold because of courage alone. It holds because somebody keeps the machine from tearing itself apart. And still, control remains partial. You can prepare routes, check watches, question timings, and read every report twice. Then rain comes, or shell fire cuts the trench, or a runner disappears, or the plan meets the ground and changes shape. That is when rank reveals its cruelest truth. Responsibility keeps expanding long after control has stopped keeping pace. And at the highest level, even that imbalance will begin to feel small. By the time you reach Lieutenant Colonel, the trench no longer arrives to you as one wall of mud and one set of boots. It arrives as a battalion stretched across a line that is too long, too wet, too thinly held, and too dependent on men who are already tired in ways no report can measure cleanly. From this height, authority looks larger from the outside than it feels from within. You receive objectives from brigade, timings from above, assumptions from staff officers working over maps in places drier than yours. On paper, The battalion has shape. 4 companies, supporting guns, reserve positions, communication routes. In reality, every one of those lines contains weakness, a company below strength, a trench section that floods first, a route the stretchers may not clear in time, a junior officer who is technically ready and inwardly near his limit. Then the attack date comes. You walk the line before it begins, and men change slightly when they see you. They straighten. They study your face for an answer you do not have. This is the loneliness of rank at the top. Your presence must look steadier than your certainty feels. In the briefing dugout, procedure says one thing. Experience says another. The artillery timetable is too optimistic. The eastern wire has not been cut well enough. The evacuation route is exposed. You raise what you can. Some of it is amended. Most of it remains. So you give the order anyway. Because wars at this level are full of decisions made between bad options and no clean truth. And when it begins, the cost is no longer measured in tasks or patrols or one frightened private. It is measured in names. And once war has turned names into responsibility, it does not easily give them back. And then, one day, the war ends in the way large wars do, not with a feeling big enough to contain what happened, but with an order, an hour, a silence that arrives strangely late, as if the guns themselves do not quite believe they are supposed to stop. You are still alive when it happens, which is not a small thing. For years, survival was the moving target behind every duty, every rank, every correction made in the dark, before it became a mistake with a funeral after it. Now the firing thins, then ceases, and the first truth that reaches you is not triumph. It is absence. No incoming rounds. No shouted warning passing down the trench. No need to measure the next few minutes by how many men may still be standing when they are over. The silence should feel like mercy. Instead, at first, it feels untrustworthy. You have lived too long in a world where quiet usually meant the barrage had not started yet. Men around you smile, some of them. Some laugh too loudly. Some sit down where they are and say nothing at all. A few look outward over the parapet, as if expecting the war to explain itself now that it is over. It does not. It leaves behind the trench walls, the duckboards, the torn wire, the dugouts blackened by smoke, and all the names that did not make it to this morning. History will sort the dates cleanly: armistice, victory, end of operations. But the war inside the men who carried it does not obey clean language. You know that because by now you have risen far enough to understand what remained invisible at every lower level. As a private, you thought the war would end when the shelling stopped. As a corporal, you thought it might end when the men under you no longer needed your steadiness. As a sergeant, you began to understand that memory keeps its own chain of command. As an officer, you learned the worst part of responsibility was not giving the order. It was remembering the faces attached to it afterward. That is what stays. Not the map references, not the communiques, not the phrases used by men far from the trench to make slaughter sound orderly. What stays is smaller and more personal than that. The young private taken off a raid and left alive long enough to become someone else. The runner who did not come back. The man who kept saying he was fine until he was not. The letter in your tunic, softened by damp, carried through nights when home felt less like a place than like evidence that another world still existed. The smell of churned earth after rain. The hour before dawn, when every nerve in the body learned to wait for impact. When you finally leave France and go home, People look at you for signs they can understand. Weight lost. Hair touched by gray too early. A stiffness in the way you stand. They do not see the deeper rearrangement. They do not see how ordinary comfort now feels provisional, how a slammed door moves through you faster than reason, how sleep has become a negotiation rather than a refuge. They do not know that part of you still measures rooms for exits, still counts distance the way artillery taught you to count, still listens for tone before words, because men in trenches learned early that fear speaks through cadence before it speaks through meaning. History will remember the war in dates, offensives, maps, and names carved into stone. But the men who lived inside it remember something narrower and heavier. They remember the face beside them in half-light, the sound of boots in flooded boards, the strange intimacy of shared exhaustion. The way responsibility kept widening until even survival no longer felt like a simple thing to be grateful for. At the beginning, the trench was mud, cold, smoke, and fear. At the end, it is still all of those things. But now it is also this, the knowledge that you did not grow older in war because time passed. You grew older because each time the war asked for more, you found a way to remain in your place and carry it.